And we're so happy to see all of you joining. And now let me give the floor to Tommaso, who will give an introduction to the general issue of biodiversity. Tommaso, please take the floor.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I'm not a boomer and I can do it without any problem. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So, hi, everybody. I am Tommaso, and I am supposed to get you lit up on this Saturday morning to then listen to people with much more interesting presentation than mine. So this is the introductory section, and I will explain what is biodiversity and why we should care about it. So I think the most important thing is to start with the definition. I can see, there we go. Okay, so the definition that I would like you guys to use, and I think it's good to have the same common language when we talk about biodiversity, is in Article 2 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it reads, biological diversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystem. Now, this is the fancy definition. This is the definition that scientists use. And as you understand that I use the word fancy, I'm no scientist. I studied policy in my bachelor and in diplomacy in my master. So, but it's good to have a common understanding. One key message of this is, this means all life, basically. So you can summarize this in all life. It doesn't mean, however, nature, because nature includes also non-living things. So like there's the concept of geodiversity and rivers. So this is a first definition, like the definition that we should use, in my opinion. And it's good to have this common basis of understanding when we enter negotiation rooms, when we talk to other people. But one thing that I want you guys to take away from this workshop is that the definition is the first part is to have a common understanding at the table, but then we need to move forward. So scientists in other aspects also, for example, on protected areas or in other topics related to biodiversity, tend to stick and trying to elaborate the most correct definition ever, and they spend years wasting time on that, which is great on one side because the scientific debate should go forward, but the action should also go forward. So a lot of resources go into a definition, but then we should move forward into actions. And biodiversity, when we think about biodiversity, we think of the Amazon rainforest or the coral reef in Australia, but it's much closer to us than what we think. I'm reading this book. It's called Darwin Comes to Town, and I suggest you guys to read it. If you don't want to read the book, there's also the TED Talk, and it's about how humans and how the urban jungle influenced evolution. And it has so many incredible examples of how biodiversity adapted to us and how different ecosystems are being created in each garden in a small rural town in England, for example, or in the Netherlands. He's from Rotterdam. And at least for me, lockdown taught us that. I was lucky enough to move into a house. I moved to Brussels the day lockdown started. So I think I'm the word expert on internships in lockdown, because the day I started, lockdown started. But I had a garden and I spent hours looking at snails or trying to see how I could bring pollinators in my garden. And this was really this book was eye-opening for me, I have to admit. And I also started to look more at how biodiversity is embedded in my daily life. I think this was one of the aims from this workshop. And when I come home at night after a couple of beers, I try to look for foxes. If you come in Odergem in Brussels and you see like a lunatic going around trying to chase foxes, that's me. But then the next question that I wanted you guys to answer, this was one of the greatest articles during lockdown. It's from a city in Wales where people were not allowed to go out, so just goats took over it, and they didn't trash it, but they made sure that humans knew who was the king in town. The pictures are amazing. I will share the link after. But the second question is, why should we care? And I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast. I am Italian, so we tend to do that. So if I'm speaking too fast, please write it in the chat, and I'll try to slow down. But why should we care? And on why should we care? I mean, we should all care about biodiversity, that is a given. But when you try to communicate to people why should we care about it, you need to understand the audience you're giving it to. So if you're going to someone who's strongly economically minded, allow me the term, you can't explain to him that biodiversity is beautiful, all life forms are complexes and perfect and whatever. You need to put it in terms that they would understand. So in the next slides, there are different ways to kind of communicate why we should care about biodiversity. The first one is very simple. Our life depends on it. These are called the ecosystem services. So these are the services that nature provides us, the biodiversity provides us, my bad. And they're divided into regulating, supporting, provisioning, and cultural values. And they go from the very first basic things of cycle of water that you learn in primary school to existent values and ethical values. Also, of course, there's all the provisioning services. So there's food, fiber, biomass, fuel, fresh water. So without biodiversity, life as we know it would not exist. Life could continue in some other ways, but it's not a way that we want to. So the first point when you try to communicate why we should care about it is that we depend on it. It's as simple as that. Then, as I said, if you go on Wall Street or, I don't know, at the European Central Bank and you want to explain why biodiversity care, you can also say that our economy depends on it. And this is data from a World Economic Forum report, that over half of the world total GDP is highly or moderately highly dependent on nature. So you could also put it in economic terms. I know there's some discussions about putting a value to nature and how that is not the most ideal thing to do. But as I said, you need to be sure of who you're talking to. So if that could be talking about jobs and talking about the value of nature could be a way to communicate this importance. And also the risk for business. There is another report always from the World Economic Forum that analyzes the top risk every year for businesses. And I think it has been 3 or 4 years in a row that biodiversity and environmental risks are in the top 5. So there's also that dimension of it. Then if you go to someone more passionate and more enthusiastic about biodiversity, and biodiversity nerds like us, I would say, you can also try to explain with the intrinsic value and the beauty of it and the complexity of it and the biology behind it. And that is, for me, fascinating because, as I said, I'm no scientist. So it's really cool when a scientist explains me, I don't know, this kind of ants, what it does and whatnot. So this is another way that you can try to communicate it. And the last but not least is for our mental health. I hope I'm not on top of the screen, but here you go. For our mental health, this is very important at a time in which finally mental health is getting the attention it deserves. This was, for example, a report from the Institute of European Environmental Policy, and it was released during lockdown. And it shows how there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that spending time in nature improves our mental health, improves our own well-being. So going back to the ecosystem services that I said before, this is another component of it. So spending time in nature actually helps us physically, mentally, and just for the sake of it, as we said. So these are the 4 reasons that I wanted to highlight today. I had 10 minutes and I wanted you guys to talk. So my next question for you all is, how do you think biodiversity affects your life? I think there was one of the expectations in the workshop was, how does biodiversity affect my daily work? It would be very useful to know what work you do. For example, I've been working in biodiversity policy for 2 years now. And so that affects my work because that's what I do. But if you could share what you do and why you wanted to understand how biodiversity affects your life, that would be great. I'm going to stop sharing and maybe, I know I'm going to ask you guys something that is terrible. I'm going to ask you guys to please turn on your camera. This is a Saturday morning. You might be in bed, so don't feel afraid. There you go. Thanks, Saki. So my question for you is, how do you think that biodiversity affects your life? And if that is a too complicated question, what is the most exotic animal or fancy animal that you've seen in your city? So these are the 2 questions that I want you guys to think about. For me, it's a fox. You know, I come from the Alps, so I have a very weird perception of what is exotic. For me, flamingos are extremely exotic, but for a lot of people, they aren't. So up to you. How do you think biodiversity affects your life? And what is the most, let's use this exotic word, exotic animal you've seen in your town? I'm gonna be like a middle school professor. So if you guys don't talk, I'm gonna pick on people. First on this.
Let me start again. Sorry, like when you said about fox, so it was reminding me of my of my childhood days. So like I was I was I was born and I was grown up in the military background here in Bangladesh. So the places where my father was posted, most of them were rural areas. So I remember that I used to get encounter with the foxes and uh, up at night, like the way they used to whistle. So that's the thing. So but right now, presently, like living in the urban areas. So right now, due to loads of technologies and stuffs and like that. So I believe that there isn't any fox. So, however, at times the area where I am living up in Dhaka, that is the capital city of Bangladesh, I often encounter with monkeys and sort of like, because the thing is the way the bush and the trees have been cut off, all those monkeys been just migrated up into the residential areas and stuff. So that's a bit a mess or a mess. And but however we have to deal with this things up. So that's my perspective. So that's it. If you want to say.
That is also good to mention. I have a very European perspective because I grew up in Europe and I lived most of my life in Europe. But for example, Mumbai has the highest densities of leopards in the world, for example. So there's different interaction between human and nature. Anybody else, maybe?
Maybe I can share my perspective. So I'm a student. I'm in a dual degree program between France and the US. So I'm studying quite a lot of subjects. I would say I'm an interdisciplinary student. And for me, biodiversity is an inspiration to observe different subjects and different fields and to enhance my interdisciplinary view. For example, to an engineer, biodiversity would be to help them to make more innovation because we learn from the animals, we learn from different species, we learn from the animal's life. And to an economist, it's about to improve the competitiveness of their product because they can differentiate themselves from the rest. And to a mental health, a psychiatrist, maybe it's more about creating art or creating scenes that really heal people or to cure the trauma for the military people. For the human rights activists, it's more about to know the intrinsic value, not only within human, but also like within other animals, species, and etc. So that's what biodiversity means to me.
That is good. For the most exotic animal in the city is a seagull because we're very far from the sea. Yes, I have a crush on Paris, so that is the seagull. I think it's quite. I've been there quite a lot, and the seagull I think it's quite exotic for Paris. In the UK, green parrots. Green parrots, and I think that somebody let the cages, let them out of the cages. Cape Town. Okay, I had 10 minutes, so I think now you will hear from the other speaker, and yeah, I'll also learn more. So I'm just going to mute myself.
Okay, so now we are transitioning to the main 3 section because in this workshop, we will be looking at biodiversity from a chronological perspective. So we will invite 3 speakers to talk about the past, the present, and the future. So we have a thorough understanding. So our next speaker is joining us from London, and his name is Felix. Felix, do you want to take the floor?
Yes, I would be very happy to do so. Thank you very much, Hyla, and everybody else for putting this together, and to all of those that are taking time on a Saturday to join us. Yes, I was going, let me just share my screen. Yeah, here it should be. Oh, okay. Yes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit first about the past. So European narratives, actions, and engagement. And to start this off, I thought today maybe we could talk a little bit about, how do I go to the next slide? There we go. We could take a first look at what some consider the root of the environmental twin crises, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis at the moment. We could look at what many consider the root of this, and such as colonialism and specifically European colonialism, and how that how that intertwines with biodiversity. Then move on, look a little bit about, talk a little bit about Europe's targets, the EU's targets that they set themselves for 2020, and how the EU thinks they're doing on those targets or did on those targets. And those two parts aren't necessarily going to be super happy, all of them. So maybe then to end on a note where we can look at, actually there's a lot of reasons for hope and a lot of things each of us can do to try and change the world for the better. So without further ado, I would just move on to the next one. Yes. Yes, so Europe, colonialism and biodiversity. There's increasing literature that actually points that a lot of the traumatic exploitation of nature traces its origins back to early colonialism. By colonialism, I mean this original belief that one group of people have the rights over the people, land, water, and resources of a place where another group of people live, and the system is supported and reinforced by a set of practices that benefit the colonizers. In the European context, the Catholic Church and later on also the Anglican Church played a very big role in European colonialism. And in the 1450s, the Catholic Church declared something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a directive to Western European explorers that any land that they discovered, so wasn't known to Western Europeans before, was theirs for the taking, so long as the inhabitants were not Christians. And this really gave Europeans at the time what they thought would be the moral and ethic grounds to go and colonize the world in the name of religion in many cases. So yeah, European colonists really saw these new territories that they thought that they discovered as places with unlimited resources to exploit, with very little consideration for the long-term impacts. They exploited what they considered to be an unending frontier at the service of early modern state-making and capitalist development. Just to look at some examples, and there's sadly a lot of these. So British colonists transformed the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia into a plantation economy to meet the needs of industrial Britain and America. This included the expanding demand for cheap rubber during the Industrial Revolution. So exploitative colonial policies in Singapore and the peninsula limited the economic options of poor Malays, Indians, and Chinese. So these workers were increasingly forced to clear-cut vast areas of rainforest to literally carve out a living for themselves at the expense of local ecosystems. Meanwhile, more than half a century after the end of colonial rule in the Malay Peninsula, the overexploitation of local resources through extensive logging continues. Once numerous, Malayan tigers, for instance, they are now classified as critically endangered species due in part to habitat loss from logging and road development. And deforestation in Malaysian Borneo also continues to accelerate, mainly due to the ongoing global demand for palm oil and lumber. Another example, under colonial rule, the export of minerals, timber, and opium from Myanmar expanded enormously, placing unprecedented strain on local ecosystems. So today, this exploitation still continues and is generating billions of euros in revenue. And yet these regions are some of the poorest in the country, are home to widespread human rights abuses and environmental disasters. Another example, and I added the photo here on the left, that's a photograph from 1892. Americans, well, European colonizers in the US killing, murdering huge amounts of American bison. What you see here they're all American bison skulls that are waiting to be ground for fertilizer. Another one in going to Africa, the environmental cost of the diamond trade is devastating across Africa. And further than that, other mining for other resources such as bauxite and also extraction of oil, timber, and minerals. And this mining serves as a global demand for these mining minerals and gems. So the intensive mining operations required to deliver diamonds and other precious stones or minerals to world markets degrades the land, reduces air quality, pollutes local water sources, and rapidly degrades biodiversity. Again, going back to when European powers carved up the continent in the so-called scramble for Africa during the late 19th century, commercial exports came to replace slavery as the primary economic motivation for direct colonial occupation. Yeah, so a lot of really bleak things. But when we think about colonialism in the past, it's not really something that has completely stopped. There's a report at the moment. There's reports at the moment that suggest that Africa is on the verge of a fresh mining boom, driven by demand in Europe, North America, India, and China that will only worsen existing ecological crises. Consumer demand for minerals such as tantalum, which is a key component for the production of electronics, lies at the heart of this mining boom. And as I said before, our understanding of colonialism is often limited to simple ideas about what we think colonialism looked like in the past. These ideas, however, impede our ability to identify the complex ways that colonialism shaped and continues to shape the uneven power structures of the 21st century. And unequal power relations between and within developed and developing countries continue to define the causes and consequences of climate change and biodiversity loss. Going back just to the beginning, I mentioned this doctrine of discovery. This was only renounced by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, last year in 2021, and many post-colonial regimes still formally recognize the doctrine of discovery in all its manifestos. And neither the Vatican nor the Church of England have annulled their documents that gave moral and religious support for this doctrine. So it very much is an ongoing struggle. What many see as traditional conservation also has roots in colonialism. What this Western ideal of what nature looks like, of what wilderness looks like, always excludes people. It sets people and nature apart. So when the first protected areas, when they created the first protected areas were created, a lot of communities that used to live on these lands harmoniously in harmony with nature were displaced, leading to what's called fortress conservation. I also wanted to say, just because I know I can sometimes get a little carried away in these things. So if there's any questions that you have while I speak, or any points that you would like to share, perspectives from your experience that could be relevant to any of this, please do feel free to just write it in the chat box or unmute yourself and join in. But yeah, so Just on the protected area thing, on the forest conservation side of things, there's actually millions of people that have been displaced in the name of biodiversity protection and biodiversity conservation since 1900. There's a little bit more than 100,000 protected areas recognized all over the world. Yes, so just moving on from this, I just thought it would be important to really, first of all, root this conversation that we're having today in what got us to this situation, and really understand the role that European the role that European powers had in this process. Obviously, the EU is trying to do better. We're in 2010, they set a set of 6 targets that they wanted to meet to promote biodiversity conservation, protection, and restoration within the EU, but also abroad, globally. And in 2019, the EU shared what's called a national report to the Convention on Biological Diversity, in where they reflected and looked at the data on how the EU and its member states were doing on these targets that they set for themselves in 2010. And we'll just walk through some of these now. There was one target that was to fully implement the Birds and Habitats directives, which are 2 of the main tools the EU has and its member states have at disposal to promote nature conservation. The EU found that there is that there is evidence that these directives have reduced pressure on biodiversity, but not quickly enough. There's particular problems actually with halting declines of species outside of protected areas in Europe. Let me see. Yeah, I've been told that I'm taking too much time, so I'll try to move a little faster. Sorry about that. Another target was to maintain and restore ecosystems and their services. And progress has been made on this as well, again, on policy and knowledge improvement. But again, this has not yet halted the trend of degradation of ecosystems and their services in Europe. Especially, there was one assessment by the IPAS in 2018 that looked at land degradation and restoration in Western Europe, and particular that showed that national policy responses to land degradation within this region are often short-term, local level, and insufficiently resourced. So solutions are often reactive, focusing on mitigation rather than avoidance. Another target was to achieve a more sustainable agriculture. And I think anybody in this Zoom room with us today that followed a little bit the conversations around the Common Agricultural Policy last year knows that that also didn't really go very well. The Common Agricultural Policy, to those that don't know it, has evolved to incorporate biodiversity objectives and corresponding measures to mitigate detrimental impacts of agriculture in Europe. However, there's a lot of data that now shows us that, for instance, farmland birds are declining, grassland butterflies are declining, biodiversity that is associated with agriculture is rapidly declining in Europe. And land use change is the major driver of biodiversity loss of both biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe. One reason is production-based subsidies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy, have led to intensification in agriculture and forestry, and together with urban environments has led to biodiversity decline. In addition to that, the EU Renewable Energy Directive from 2009 was also shown to have driven an increase in biofuel production and consumption in Western and Central Europe. So there's a real risk that biofuel production can compete with food production, as well as negatively impacting biodiversity. both within the EU, but also abroad. The similar target to achieve a more sustainable forestry also didn't really show any significant change or progress. Although EU forest area has increased as compared with in 2010, the ecological condition of these forests is of concerns. So meaning that, yes, we have more forests, but really the biodiversity within these forests isn't necessarily healthy, and is still on a declining trend. Moving away from agriculture and forests and terrestrial environments to the seas, there apparently has been some progress to make fishing more sustainable and to improve the state of our seas, but again with not with enough progress to really meet the target. The one target where the EU has actually achieved really good progress is on combating invasive alien species. And overall, the EU's contribution to halting biodiversity loss globally, there has been some progress, but particular EU demand and dependency on agricultural commodities from Africa, the Americas, and Asia has driven the expansion of monoculture crops abroad and plantations across these continents. So overall, the progress is sadly inefficient in reducing the impacts of EU consumption patterns on global biodiversity. The very bleak conclusion of this report is that there has not been any significant progress towards halting biodiversity loss in Europe and abroad. Just very quickly wrapping up, there's some good news here. Everybody can and should play a role in this, and it's fantastic to see everybody join here today. You can all, and I think a lot of you already are active citizens, you can make biodiversity and the environment your priority when voting. You can support biodiversity and environmental advocacy or engage with it, such as, if you haven't joined the Global Youth Biodiversity Network at the European chapter yet, please do so. Or if you're from somewhere else, like in Bangladesh, join your local chapter. Engage with the political process as much as possible. Go to protests, engage in consultations, speak with your local MPs. Small actions also do matter. You do biodiversify your community. Work in your gardens or on your balconies. The small things really do matter. You can adapt your shopping and consumption behavior. It really is about thinking globally, but acting locally. And then the last one, which cannot be stressed enough, money really matters. Your bank choice matters. Look at, is your bank, I can share report by share action. There's more and more data on which banks are fueling more environmental destructions and which aren't. If you're already working and you have a pension fund, that matters a lot as well. Pension funds are some of the biggest supporters of environmental destructions in many cases. So do put your money, do put your pension into funds that don't fuel that. And if you can, support conservation directly. If you have a little bit to spare, do support conservation actions, if possible, locally led conservation actions. I'm aware we ran a little bit over time, but I'll be happy to just afterwards share some links in here if you want to read up on a little bit more on these things. Thank you so much, and sorry for running over the time.
It's okay. Thank you so much, Felix. Yeah, it's very important, just as he said, we need to do a combination of collective actions and individual small actions because they all matter. Felix's presentation really reminded me of Europe's, it's very interesting to compare the Europe colonialism and the modern biodiversity laws, because Europeans used to be the colonizers who didn't respect the political boundaries in Africa, who destroyed the culture, wiped out the tribes. And I just think it's very inspirational to learn from history and also to realize that biodiversity is not only about animals and plants, but also within human species. Because when we, as humans, when we have more languages, more cultures, we will be more resistant to the human crisis. So it's important to realize, just as Tommaso introduced, there is the diversity between species and then within species. So I mean, I really love that. It was an interesting comparison. And in the next section, we will invite Jessica to introduce the present, which there is a really important thing going on, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the CBD right now is trying to incorporate youth delegates. So maybe in the future, who knows, you will be one of the delegates to on the CBD sharing your views. So let's welcome Jessica.
Thank you so much, Hyla, for introducing me. I'm Jessica. I'm from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network's European chapter, and we try and advocate for youth voices to be heard in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also to communicate what's happening there and how it's happening there to young people on the ground. So that's one of the things I'm doing today. Maybe can I see a show of hands? Who of you know a little bit about the CBD? Maybe use your reaction, and you can use a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Okay, a lot of thumbs up. That looks quite positive. So I will be sharing a presentation that I got from Christian, the founder. There's a lot of information on the slides, but I'll try and go through and only talk about the key point. If you have any questions or if anything is unsure, just write it in the chat, please. Okay. Is it full screen for everyone? Okay. So there is a book as well. So if you are curious and you want to look deeper into the things, you can go and download the CBD in a nutshell from the given.org website. Yeah, so I suggest that. So what is the history? I'm going to go back just a little bit. Before we had the Convention on Biological Diversity, we had all of these environmental governance frameworks, but they all focused on these little silos, like only migratory species, only wetlands. And so in order to bring all of these thoughts together and to think about global threats like the climate crisis, we had the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And from this meeting, all the world leaders decided, yes, we have a global environmental crisis, and we will establish at least 3 different bodies to look at what we think are the big global issues. So the one is the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. The second one is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC. And then we also have the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD. So those are the 3 big conventions that are trying to tackle these global summits. This is just the start of acronyms. So I'm going to be trying not to use them, but sometimes the words can be, or the phrases can be really long, so I might still use them. But I hope that if anything is confusing, that you can just write in the chat, and one of my fellow activists can also just tell you what the acronym means. Okay. So the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has 3 objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, but also the sustainable use of biodiversity. And lastly, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. This is very, very specific, but also in the times of technology and genetics and all sorts of things that can be done in a lab now, this is very important, that any benefits, especially monetary benefits, especially profits from big companies, are shared with the people on the ground who showed them how to look for the enzymes and the catalysts that they needed for their work. And this is actually, that last bit is one of the reasons that the US has not actually signed and ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, because a lot of very big corporations have their headquarters in the US, and they do not want to share their genetic resources, unfortunately, or their benefits from the genetic resources that they have taken from other countries and other peoples. So all of the countries of the world, except the USA and the Holy See or Vatican, that's not allowed to, has signed and is a party of the CBD. Even North Korea, I checked this last night, even North Korea, just saying. So why is the CBD important? And basically, to tackle biodiversity loss, we need to tackle it as the world. You know, this isn't just something that Brazil needs to solve, or you know, the Congo. This is something that everybody needs to help with and look out for. But it is incredibly challenging because biodiversity is not spread equally among all different countries. I mean, a biodiversity hotspot in Denmark looks very different from a high biodiversity hotspot in the Amazon. Yeah, so it provides an overarching mandate for governments to address biodiversity, and it also provides a global platform for governments to meet, to have a dialogue, to collaborate, to build partnerships, to help and support one another, and also to show off if they're doing a good job, which also helps in terms of moving things along. Then it also creates global standards. So it asks everybody to measure things the same way so that we can then compare different countries, that we can look at like a global consensus. So we have headline indicators and things like that. So how is the CBD implemented? You'll hear very often that it's non-binding, you know, and that there aren't sanctions if you don't meet goals or if you don't do what you're supposed to. But the idea is that at the CBD, everybody agrees on these goals. It's done by consensus, so every single party needs to agree for something to be adopted. Then the national government takes that target and puts it into their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. This is an acronym called NBSAP. And in that strategy and action plan, they will say, okay, in order to reach this goal, we will implement this law. In order to reach that goal, we will set up this program. And in that way, it's a country's responsibility to put things into legally binding mechanisms. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's one of the things that we have, but also, you know, the way that the CBD works with this full consensus is that if we were to ask for something that's legally binding, every single country in the world will have to say yes. And obviously they don't want to do that. So that's why with the consensus, we can't get something that's legally binding at the international level, because not every country is going to say, yes, I want sanctions if I don't fulfill my jobs. Yeah, so what is a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan? So this is the planning instrument. Every country is supposed to create one and submit it to the CBD. All of these are available at the website. I highly recommend that you go and check your country's plan, see what it says about the things you're interested in, about the marine environment or about young people, see what it doesn't say. That's always something to look into as well. And there they also have national targets as well for their own country. Then in addition to that, every country needs to submit national reports. They need to tell the CBD how they're doing. Like, this was our plan, this is how it's going. And up until now, most countries have submitted 5 or 6 national reports based on their national action, NBSAP. These are also available, so you can track them as well. So the CBD is pretty complicated. Nothing at an international level is ever simple. So this is basically what it looks like. There's a secretariat that does mostly administration things. There are subsidiary bodies that I'll talk about just now. You know, there are parties. That's what we call governments. Governments that have signed and ratified the convention are parties. Governments that haven't, like the USA, are called non-parties. And then we have organizations and civil society who are observers. So usually the floor is given to parties first, then to non-parties, and then to observers when the time comes to speak. We also have financial mechanisms. So you hear people talk about the JEF, the JEF, or other financial instruments. In basically that is one way in which we try and overcome this difference in biodiversity between different countries. It's often the countries that have already exploited their biodiversity that have the money, and the countries that haven't yet exploited their biodiversity that don't have the money. So the idea is to make sure that the money filters from those that have more to those that need it to protect and conserve their biodiversity. So the COP does work within the framework of the United Nations. And the COP just stands for the Conference of the Parties. Many conventions have COPs. The climate COP you've probably heard about in Glasgow last year. When we talk about the biodiversity COP, we're talking about COP15 that's supposed to happen in Kunming in China. It's the highest decision-making body of the CBD, but not the only place where decisions are made. It meets every 2 years. That's why we're on the 15th COP, whereas the climate COP is on the 26th COP, because that meets every year. This is where the parties come together and they make final decisions on things. Then we have these meetings that happen between those 2 years. We've got SBSTA and we've got SBI. And SBSTA is about what to do, looking at the science of it. What do they say is the best indicator to measure this target? How many publications are there? How many different countries use it? And things like that. They look at things like baselines. You know, if we're going to make the target reduce pollution by X%, since when? It's very important, and it can change a lot in terms of making a target ambitious or not. And then SBI is how to do it, looking at all the other things around it, like resource mobilization, that's getting the money, getting it to the place, making sure the admin isn't too high so that people can access it, making sure there's capacity development, and teaching people how to use technology if some of the things are measured with technology, and so forth. There are also these other working groups that also produce suggestions and reports, and one of them is the working group on Article 8J. And this is about Indigenous people and their rights to land and customs. You can look into that further if you're interested. They play a very active role in the CBD. And then we have these other things called protocols. So some of the countries came together to write a protocol, which they have also signed and ratified. Not every country in the CBD has signed and ratified all of these protocols. The two main important ones is the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. So this is all about, customs, border control, invasive species, biotechnology, anything that's a risk to the country or a risk to the people. Then we also have the Nagoya Protocol, and that's more about the access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. And this very much influences even students that want to research, use genetic data from countries that is not the country that they're studying in. And you've got to fill out all sorts of paperwork to make sure that you're sharing benefits, even publications, even funding, and share it with the countries that you're doing your research in. And then we have the CBD Secretariat. They're basically an administration body of the convention. They organize meetings, prepare documents, assist governments, but they don't take any decisions. Okay. And then lastly, we have IPBES. So the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So you might have already heard there's an equal body for the climate COP. I think that's called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel to Combat Climate Change, on climate change. And this is basically the biodiversity version of it. They submit reports, and then they give it to all the countries at the COP and present their findings. And that's when the governments can either say they accept the findings or they disagree. Unfortunately, they can't say that. And how are decisions being made? So the COP happens every 2 years, and the working groups, the SBI and the SBSTA, all happen in this period in between called the intersessional period. Now, one of the things that happens there is that a lot of decisions are made there because there are a lot of things where everyone just agrees a good idea. Like they discuss it, they say, okay, this is fine. it's not the big issue that we need to fight about. At the COP, that's where the real, like the final nitty-gritty things, the things that the world is divided on, that's where it really gets hammered out, and they get stuck in rooms where they talk it out until they really need to sleep or they really need to eat, and then they just have to come to a consensus. So that's one of the issues of doing it online, is you don't have this pressure to get it done, because online you can get someone to bring you food, you can switch off your video and take a nap and then come back later and continue to argue and argue. And there were also time limits to negotiating online. So this is why there's a big push now to do things in person, because only then can decisions really be taken. So looking back at all of these things that I've mentioned, so how are decisions made? So you've got the parties, the governments, and you've got the Secretariat. So they set agenda, they create draft texts, and then everybody comes together to discuss those. They have time to think about their answers, to consult with their stakeholders, and then they come to these meetings and they say, listen, we want this, we approve, or we don't, or we want to change the wording. Then that gets discussed. The decisions that aren't made then get taken at the COP. At the COP, I said there are final negotiations. It takes about 2 weeks, and it's a consensus, which means every single one has to agree. So our participation, as given, we are the youth constituency. We count as civil society. Yeah. Okay. We count as civil society. We get access to almost all of the negotiating sessions. Sometimes there are private sessions and you need to be specifically invited by the chair of that session to participate, to enter. We can deliver statements, and we do so on behalf of the youth. And in order to know what to say at those statements, we do youth consultations. We also use the things we find from our consultations to draft priorities, like things that young people have told us they really want. And then we also lobby directly. We call up the EU and we say, can we meet with you next week urgently and discuss this thing? And then we share, like, what is your position on it? This is our position on it. Where is it different? Like, can we explain why we think that ours is better? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we really do our best to get these youth priorities taken up by other countries, because only when the parties agree with it will it be taken onto the floor. Yeah, we can also organize side events. So we do a lot of campaigning and awareness raising in the events, but we ourselves don't have any voting rights. So we can't veto anything if we think it's a bad idea, and we can't put anything on the table that a country hasn't supported us with and will say we'll support that. So we have to be quite strategic what we think countries will accept. Yeah. Then for the last decade, we've had the strategic plan called the Aichi targets. Basically, we did pretty bad, as you heard lastly. There were some, the ones in green, where we did quite well. As a world, we have made a lot of progress and good progress towards making those. Invasive alien species is one of them. 10% of marine areas is another, and 17% of terrestrial areas conserved is another one. And then we've got things like the Nagoya Protocol coming into force, and people creating their MBSAPs. So those are things that have done really, really well. But the things that really drive biodiversity loss, the using more than you should, habitat loss, and things like that, we did really bad in. Those are the red ones. So now we have the chance. So one of the reasons this failed is because of money. And when they say how much money did we need, it's billions. But that's relative. When you think about how much governments have, how much they spend on other things, then you realize that they could have done it. So we put a lot of pressure on governments to say, hey, you have the money. If you really believed, if you really thought this was a crisis, you'd be doing something, right? So here are just some examples of governments spending money for things that they could have been spending on our futures. So where are we now? We've got a new strategy for the next decade. It's called the post-2020 because it goes beyond targets just to 2030. This is still being discussed at the moment, and it should be finalized at the next COP, which has been moved for the last 2 years. So this is the logo for the COP. It's called COP15. It should happen in China. There are rumors that it will still happen this year. Sorry, it still says 2021, but it's 2022 now, and we hope that it really will happen. And what are our expectations? So we as young people really want to make sure that it's a framework for all, for organisms, for plants, for people, for indigenous people, that it has human rights integrated across it, that it has measurable goals, that we can actually implement it, that they don't just use waffle language that we don't know how to reach, and stuff like that. There's a theory of change, and if this sounds familiar to you, that's good. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. But basically, it's a way to measure progress, to say, okay, we've got our goals for 2050, we've got milestones for 2030 and 2040, so that we can track our progress and measure ourselves along the way as we go. And so this is the current design for the strategy that they have, the post-2020, but it's still under negotiation. And some of the current challenges is focusing on top-down approaches. We've noticed as young people that bottom-up approaches are often more successful, and that if you bring people along and if you scale up things that already work at smaller scales to larger scales, it's sometimes better than just trying to change things from the top and not knowing how it's going to land at the bottom. Then we've got the CBD is really relatively good at taking decisions, but not implementing it. It's up to the countries to really implement it, and so forth. Some of the other challenges is that there are some really key issues where there's a massive divide between global north and global south. Some of these are biotechnology, funding, and the 30 by 30. And so these are really big issues that need to be discussed at the COP, and even before the COP, to try and get to some level of consensus. Because we can only do what the person is, what the country that's the least willing is able to do. And in Europe, we've got youth priorities. We did a consultation in January 2021, and we've got these 6 priorities that we really campaign for. So there's sustainable consumption and production, combating climate change, environmental education and awareness, stakeholder participation, integrity of natural ecosystems, and mainstreaming biodiversity. We had 35 different youth organizations from over 16 different countries who contributed to this. And we use it a lot in terms of trying to lobby and campaign on these points. If you want to find out more, you can find the document on our website. What is also upcoming are Geneva Negotiations. So basically all the negotiations that were now held online will be finalized in person. That means it isn't just SBSTA, it isn't just SBI, all 3 are happening at once, which is going to be crazy intense. As young people, we're going to be there. There's a small delegation of 10 people, but we only have 2 badges to be in the building at the same time. So it's going to be quite tricky. We will also be active on social media, communicating what is happening. And at the same time, in March, we have the Given Youth Wave of Action, and the spotlight is on Europe. So we'll be quite busy in March. If you're interested in following us, that would be awesome, and participating. Here, just a list of some of the activities that will be happening in March. And so on the 1st, on Tuesday, we're going to launch the Stop the Same Given Wave of Action on Instagram. We're also going to be in Europe launching Destination 2030. And that's a booklet of 10 policy briefs that we've written over the last year. Then on the 12th of March, there's this big event with UNESCO talking about rethinking conservation. So everything that Felix mentioned, we're going to be discussing that and how we can do better and how we can progress in the way we think about conservation. Then on the 14th, there'll be a Stand with Nature vigil held outside the UN buildings. And young people from all over Europe, you can participate. You can ask your organizations if you want to take part in this, and you can reach out to me if you're interested. Then on the 25th, there's a global climate strike with Fridays for Future. And on the 26th, we've got Earth Hour. So March is going to be super busy. There's so many opportunities for young people to engage and especially here in Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Do you have AHA slides? Do you have questions? Like, okay, you're not using it. Okay, perfect. So I guess the biggest thing we can learn from the CBD is the fact that biodiversity conservation has 3 different levels. The first level is about conservation itself. How do we protect species? How do we protect the nature? But the second level is to achieve sustainable use during the process. For example, if you have a meal, are you going to choose the bigger meal or the smaller meal? It depends on your capacity to finish them, right? If you manage to choose the smaller one, then you make responsible consumption. And also it's about the equal sharing of benefits in the end. We need to allow youth to make contribution. We need to give the benefits to not only the governments, but also other stakeholders. So that's a very important thing we need to learn. And right now, I want to open the floor to everybody because we didn't get the time during the first section from Felix's presentation. So do we get any questions? Do you think there's any problem in terms of youth engagement, or simply if you want to learn more about how to join the CBD, how to become a delegate in one of the conference, feel free to ask questions. Okay, Tommaso.
Yeah, mine is not a question. It was just that I saw in the chat the mention of the USA. They did not ratify the CBD, but they are present at the negotiations. And with the previous administration, it was a bit tougher, read between the lines there. But the new administration has aligned also for important targets. For example, with the 30 by 30, they have the same goal. Now it's the USA, so it might take time, and there's the Senate to consider and all the internal policy making. But they didn't ratify it, but they're there. They're present in the negotiations. Just wanted to clarify that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. If we have questions, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And if we don't have question, we will move on to the next section. The next section is a presentation by Julia, and she's going to talk about what are some future actions we can do? What are some directions? What do we need to protect? What do we need to aim for? And I hope after this section, we will have more brainstorm ideas and stuff. So Julia, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, Hyla, and thanks everyone to be here today. I'm really excited about having this discussion with all of you. So yes, my presentation focused on the future, and before starting my presentation, I want to just say what I mean when I'm referring to the future. So I don't want to have the approach of having this fixed scenario that we all need to acknowledge and be prepared for, but more of a blurred border with what is our actual present, actually. Because, like when in the movies where people time travel to the past and they're like, oh, let's be super careful not to change anything, otherwise we're going to have massive repercussion in our future. So let's think it this way, that any action that we take now can actually have massive consequences and repercussion in the future. And this is what the approach I want to bring. But I mean, it's no secret that when it comes to the environment, there are some gloomy numbers and the future doesn't look so well. And I can confidently say that after this week, the future is always seems so always more depressing. In particular, I gather here some data that I think are relevant for our discussion. And as you can see, like these numbers, these dates, have these predictions of massive or relative massive loss of biodiversity. The first data, for example, refers only to terrestrial animals and only to the habitat they would lose only because of agricultural expansion. And up to 16% of vascular plants would be lost, the biodiversity of them at least, would be lost by 2050. And I think plants are often ignored when we're discussing biodiversity, but they're extremely important, especially when it comes to the relation with human health. And up to 70% of species can go extinct by 2017 if climate change continues in the way it is currently going. But this number can be kept down to 16% by 2100. It's so weird to say this number as a year. If the temperature is kept below 1.5. And you know, like these big, long and far dates seem so far. I remember when I used to read like expiration dates on water bottles, like reading 2020, and I was like, this is never gonna happen, like it's so far in time. But if we think about it, like we already reached this point, so we really need to be mindful that what we see as a far future is really like much closer than we think. And I also added this quote that refers to biodiversity loss, which is not a slippery slope, but a series of cliff edges hitting different places at different times, because it's important to know that, yes, biodiversity loss will not be overnight, but at the same time, it has different effects on different people and different places. So this has also major social and economic implication. We need to think about marginalized and or vulnerable communities, also indigenous people, and any person, community, or even country that has have different dependencies on biodiversity. So we need to acknowledge that biodiversity loss is and will be more and more linked to social and economic problems. But before going on, I want to ask you, and you can just write it in the chat, what do you think these animals have in common? So for reference, this is the Puerto Rican Amazon, the Iberian lynx, the black-footed ferret, the vaquita, the Javan rhino, and the Seychelles magpie robin. So I just want to ask you if you could tell me what these animals have in common. Just take a guess. You can write it in the chat or open up your microphone as you wish.
I believe some of them are invasive species, like, from my
Sorry,
perspective.
can I say they are endangered species and maybe in critical danger, I suppose.
Okay, well, you are all right. Like they're mostly, like some of them are threatened, some of them are really endangered. But actually what they have in common is that according to a recent study that I quoted there, these animals would have gone extinct if we hadn't taken any action after the CBD. So these animals are actually still here because of us. So I just want to show you that it's possible to save some species if we implement correct conservation measures. So, and I think now I have some slides for you, if Jess wants to.
I can share my screen.
Yes.
So if everyone can go back to the AHA slides from before.
Yes, exactly. So in 2 words or less, what is the most pressing issue to tackle in order to solve biodiversity crisis, in your opinion? So try to think about something either very specific or very direct, that is an overarching or even local issue that you think it's important to tackle. Okay, we have human consumption. Okay, world leaders, also relatable. Harmful subsidies, measuring wealth, yeah, I can see that you are all, or some of them are, many of them are relating to financial issues, which is very, very true. Lack of political will, that's definitely, as also Jess identified before, an issue. Urban space utilization. Yes, they're all great. They're all great inputs, and we're going to discuss a bit more them. But before we do that, I have another question for you. So if we can go to the next slide. Oh, in the meantime, other question. New colonialism. Yes, good one as well. So how confident are you that we will be able to tackle the biodiversity crisis? Okay, this is already interesting. Okay, I see that now the graph is tilted toward the not confident. Okay, well, I think 3 is a good average considering the circumstances. We need to be optimists, definitely, to go on and tackle this crisis effectively. And yes, I can go on sharing my screen, just if we really need to be positive, but it also makes sense, of course, to make broader consideration. So when it comes to what should the future looks like, I reposted this graph from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which shows that how different action can help restore biodiversity and move away from the graph of business as usual that will drive biodiversity down. And you can see that there are many different issues, including reduced consumption, sustainable production, cut pollution, climate change action, and conservation and restoration. And sometimes when people have this action in front of them, are wondering what is the role of the individual behavior towards the systemic change part. So it's like a chicken egg situation. Should I change the behavior and then the systemic change follows along, or should the change come from the top and individuals should follow along? So with this representation of the bee and the flower, I try to bring my perspective, which is that the two things are extremely interlinked. So if it's true that the system we have, it's the one that provides us the frame where we live in and where we have relative influence in, it's also true that individual behavior is what to some extent allowed this system to perpetrate. And I do not refer only to personal choices, because this is also a matter of capabilities, privilege, and so on. But also acknowledging the system we are in is already a great part of the part that the individual can have. While at the same time, of course, a great part of the change has to come from the system itself. So now I'm going to speak a bit about the European Union biodiversity targets. Specifically, they can be found under the European Green Deal, which is this set of measures that aim for, generally speaking, a better environment and getting the European Union net zero by 2050. And after the biodiversity for 2020 virtually failed, as Felix showed, there is a new biodiversity strategy that has a new ambitious goal that are complemented with our with other initiatives, the Farm to Fork strategy that focus on the food system, and the Zero Pollution Action Plan that focus on pollution, and they're both extremely relevant for biodiversity. Specifically speaking, I gathered here the principal goals of the biodiversity strategy by 2030. And when I say by 2030, I also want to emphasize that reaching this goal by then would mean having biodiversity enhanced. It's like an investment for the future well beyond the 2030. It does not just stop there. So for example, one of the goals is to protect 30% of EU land and sea, and strictly protecting 1/3 of it. And also restore 30% of EU habitat and species, which is really important, not only protecting, but also restoring and bringing back habitat and species. And related to agriculture, reducing by 50% the use of harmful pesticides and by 20% the fertilizers, because agriculture is really related to biodiversity, especially when it comes to pollinators that suffer from pesticides. And then reduce by 50% threatened species by invasive alien species. And I put here a domestic cat because it's interesting to think of the fact that the domestic cat is one of the most invasive species in the world, generally speaking. So it's just a fun fact. We don't think about our cat being an invasive species, but especially when cats are let roam free in rural areas and so on, they are relatively harmful to flora, to local birds and other fauna if left unchecked. But of course, the EU also plans to bring this ambition to in external action. So when it comes to ocean governance, for example, right now, there are discussions for protecting under the law of the Sea Convention, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So basically biodiversity where no state has like jurisdiction because it's beyond the borders, the maritime borders of this state. And wildlife trafficking, you might think that wildlife trafficking is only like a reality of, for example, other continents and related to ivory or rhino horns, but also in Europe we have an issue with exotic pets. That's why I put a nice lizard here, which are growing in popularity, but in many cases they're traded illegally. And then we have illegal deforestation. So an anti-deforestation law has been proposed by the European Commission last November to tackle deforestation overseas. And generally just bringing biodiversity in ambition and diplomacy. So this means mainstreaming biodiversity in multilateral agreements, but also stepping up with ambition at the CBD negotiation, for example. And this year is also going to be the CITES convention, so the one regarding endangered species trade. There are other priorities in the biodiversity strategy. You can see them here. Just to mention the one on soil, it's so interesting because soil has been so much underestimated and neglected in previous efforts, but now has his own strategy. And yeah, you can also see improved education and knowledge, which are extremely important for a long-lasting change. So what's coming in 2022? So I just wanted to put here some of the hot topics going on that you can expect to see before the end of this year. So the new restoration law will be set forward in March, hopefully. The EU is also revising the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking. The CAP national plans will be evaluated, and as was mentioned before, they do not seem super eco-friendly as for now. Guidelines on old growth and primary forests will be set forward. An action plan to conserve fishery resources and protect marine biodiversity will also be there. A strategy for biodiversity in the EU outermost areas, something that is also overlooked, but as you know, the EU has also territories overseas, for example, like French Guiana, and they of course have their own biodiversity as well. And a urban greening platform as part of the other priorities that I showed in the slide before. So the question is now, I put this nice graph here to show that it's really time for youth to try to step up and get our voices heard, because of course, first of all, we inherited this world with already the environmental problems that we have. We will be disproportionately affected by the effects of current harmful action or even inaction, because when the burden of action will be shifted on us. So it's really important as a matter of intergenerational justice as well that youth is included in the future, because we are the future, not to say a slogan, but this is the truth. And to do that, I believe that the future needs present youth voices. And with this regard, besides the specific actions that Felix mentioned, it's important to first of all get informed on biodiversity issues, but also the societal economic interlinkages and of biodiversity and other topics, and as well the political priorities and the functioning of the political system in your country region, so you know where and how you can act. You need to question the system or at least acknowledge your position in it, especially when we're referring to Europe's position towards the rest of the world. The overconsumption of Europe was mentioned before, and in this situation is of utmost importance to consider it in your actions. Amplify voices and help raising awareness, especially when it comes to fellow young people, but also to underrepresented communities and indigenous people, for example, that are going to be among the most hit by the environmental crisis. And lastly, advocate. And this can be done whether alone or by joining youth NGOs that we are all here representing as well. And on this regard, the European Youth Forum has published an advocacy handbook, which I really recommend for anyone that wants to get involved to check out. So yes, that was all. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too much over time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. And do you mind? Yeah, okay. So now we have the gallery view. And first of all, just to share some news, so after this event, I will be writing a reflection article to summarize all the key points, all the brainstorm questions, and then the statistics from our AHA slides. So don't worry if you think you didn't take all the notes, because I will be sharing them again. And the second of all, I think, we are always stronger together. Like, it would be nice if you are willing to share your LinkedIn profile in the chat box, and just exchange your social media, because we can always communicate in the future, even if we are not from the same continent. Because I myself, I'm from China, but right now I'm studying in France. And that's how I learned about my amazing organization, Youth and Environment Europe, which is the largest independent network of amazing environmental NGOs. We provide consultation, we attend meetings, we organize a lot of side events, and also we can benefit from the amazing resource and our amazing climate activists and advocacy managers. So it's very nice to just communicate and learn more about the opportunities to join and engage in such issues. So for example, in YEE, which is the organization I belong to, so every year we recruit liaison officers to help on specific environmental issues. And we also have a network of different organizations. So if you are starting an organization, feel free to join us and benefit from our resource. And also, I think Jessica and Julia belong to different amazing organizations. So feel free to introduce them as well, and just introduce how we can really engage in this environmental issue on biodiversity. So feel free to unmute and.
Thanks so much, Hyla. I put some links in the chat. I put all three of the organizations here. I put our websites, and on there you can basically have a look at what we've done. If that interests you, there's usually a sign up or a register or an application form in the case of GCE that you can apply for. We're always looking for help, and we're lots of fun people having fun, working hard. And trying to change the world. So I do recommend joining other people and getting involved as a big way to feel like you are doing something, because even though these organizations are sometimes quite small, like we do have quite a large impact in terms of the behind the scenes work we do. For Given Europe, we have a sign up form, so you can go and click on that and sign up to be a member. We are always open to members, and I'll give the floor to Julia to talk about GCE.
Yes, thanks, Jessica. So GCE stands for Generation Climate Europe, and is the largest coalition of youth-led networks at the European level on climate and environment. So GCE was established to create this platform for the youth to advocate for a just and green transition in Europe. And we bring together not only youth networks active on climate and environmental issues, but also those working on education, governance, and democracy. And actually, YE is one of our member organizations. Our goal is to push for stronger climate and environmental action from the EU level. And in particular, as for now, we focus our working groups on biodiversity, climate justice, clean mobility, sustainable development, and circular economy. So yeah, our activities range from raising awareness to direct advocacy, and generally empowering young Europeans with the tools and knowledge to advocate for better environmental policies at the EU level. And we are also looking for volunteers. Actually, right now is like the hot moment of our recruitment. In the link that Jessica posted, there is a button saying volunteer with us, and you can just see where the positions that we have open for these volunteering positions. And yeah, just apply if you're interested, or feel free to contact me as well if you have questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julia. I mean, I really appreciate that, even though Jessica said, you know, our organizations are very small, but for me personally, because in China, we don't really have the chance to engage in any NGO, you know, because of that environment. So I actually, honestly, I really appreciate the fact that I'm able to listen to United Nations Environmental Assembly and the CBD Geneva Negotiation as a real delegate. It's a really amazing chance for me to learn more and then bring back to my country of all the reflections I have. So it has been really amazing experience. So right now, we will just take 5 more minutes to allow any questions or any comments. Do you want to share your ideas, or how do you find the conference? Feel free to unmute yourself and yeah, to share your view. Okay, we're a bit silent. Then I guess you're always welcome to go back to the link, the AHA slides, and then give us some reflection, because your contribution really make us better and better in the future. So if we don't have further questions, you are free to go. And that's the end of our workshop. Thank you so much for joining us. And it has been a great, great pleasure.
Thank you.